invitation to record.
Yeah, hello, Jem and others. So I accepted it and started.
Okay, hello. So let's make the introduction then. Hello everyone, welcome to another special interest group Upjet meeting. Today is July 17th, 2024. It's another Wednesday here. So let's begin with the agenda. Let me share my screen. Okay. So hopefully we don't have many agenda items today. I hope that I'll manage to finish all of them by the end of the meeting's scheduled time. So let's begin with updates on our side, Upbound side. In the past weeks, we talked about this RDS instance creation issue. Because RDS instances took long to create, they tend to break because of timeouts, because of authentication failures and whatnot. We provided an upstream Terraform fix for it, and it is merged and released in Terraform version 5.58. We are going to consume it hopefully next week. It is scheduled for next week, but let's not promise for now. We will work on it in the remaining time. This week it occurred to me that I forgot to work on one of my promised items, a to-do that I forgot to do. Indeed, I'm going to open the async aware managed reconciler issue. I hit this one again, so it has been already past the time that I should open it. Hopefully I will open this soon, and maybe we can discuss it in detail in our next meeting. So it looks like we are out of items on our side. Blake, are you there? Would you like to talk about the item that you wrote here?
Sure. So I was noticing a kind of odd issue with secret versions. And if you look at the issue, I think I gave a fairly good summary as to what I was seeing.
All right. Would you like to take the screen? Maybe you want to walk us through it?
Sure.
All right.
Grab it open. So yeah, what I was seeing was essentially with the secret version, you know, you could create it, right? I'd have an object and then kind of point that secret version to that secret in Kubernetes, and set an init provider for the version stage. And what I was noticing is this kind of error here where it said update failed, update sync, version stage, invalid exception, parameter can be empty. But essentially, I think it's because what I did to cause this error is I essentially updated the secret manually outside of Crossplane. And I'm kind of fearful this happens on things like secret rotations as well, where essentially then it starts failing to reconcile the secret version. And maybe I'm just not using, I'll call it Crossplane, like in the correct way here. But essentially what I'm fearful of is this kind of rotation or this change to the secret version is causing Crossplane to throw a bunch of errors that it can't reconcile the resource. And I did find an upstream issue here that pretty much throws the same exact exception that I was seeing. So maybe, but this was a fixed issue at this point. So maybe this is, still a Terraform issue. Maybe this is a Crossplane issue, or it could just be a me not using Crossplane correctly issue.
Well, this is slightly out of my expertise, but if I recall correctly, our providers resolve secrets every time they reconcile. So I don't think there could be an issue with stale secrets. I would suspect more on the Terraform part.
Okay.
And which Terraform version? This was okay. This was released in 5.33, and I guess we are at 5.28 at the moment.
Okay, that would
If I'm
explain it.
not wrong. So hopefully by the next time we consume the Terraform upgraded, this might be addressed then.
Okay, that makes sense to me. I was like, because
I think we're on 550.
Oh, are we?
I
Oh.
see 531 and 550 as the Terraform
okay.
versions in the Upbound Terraform provider
Yeah,
AWS.
perhaps I confused it with another one. Maybe
One of-
GCP was in 28.
Sure.
28. Yeah. Thanks, Matt, for correcting me. Okay, then there might be something else.
Okay, because I know I'm on provider version 1.7.0, which is a couple
Yeah.
of versions behind. So that I don't know if it's been updated since 1.7.0. That maybe just an update will get us there.
I
don't remember seeing Terraform upgrade in 1.9 or 1.8, but I could totally be wrong too.
I don't think we have updated it since then.
Can
Okay.
check make file. Yeah, I used it quite
Yeah,
a bit.
550.
Yeah. Yeah, and that was 2 months ago. So yeah, okay.
So
Cool.
what you're experiencing is your use case for the secrets version resource is that there is a secret that exists in Kubernetes that you want to make available using AWS Secrets Manager, and you want to use Crossplane to populate that value.
Yeah, so I think maybe to describe the use case, right? What I want to be able to do is create, let's say I'm creating an RDS cluster or an RDS instance, and I can create some sort of admin credentials to that database. But
From the Terraform provider and then the connection secret, and then you want to push that up to Secrets Manager.
Oh, I don't even do that. So what I end up doing is just create it based off of a Kubernetes secret, get it into the admin secret, and then I attach a rotation lambda onto that secret. So that way it rotates, and so that way I have an automatically rotating set of credentials that kind of get initialized on resource creation.
But the rotation lambda is ignorant of Kubernetes, so that won't ever update that would then inevitably cause the secret version and the
change
Kubernetes to differ from the one in Secrets Manager.
Yeah, well, the secret version is I don't call it static, but it doesn't change at all.
Right.
The only thing that changes about it is the version stage. So as the Lambda goes through, it's changing it from AWS current to AWS previous, or adding the AWS previous stage onto it, right? So it changes.
There's the stage and the ID. The secret has a single version ID, a single secret version ID, and then there's a stage that is a movable pointer. And what you can mutate is which version ID does a particular stage point to.
Right.
And you can create new version IDs, but I believe you cannot delete them or update them. They're immutable.
You can, as far as I'm aware, you can not mutate version IDs, right? Like you can't delete,
right?
But you can change the pointer.
Yeah.
And so I think what's happening, my understanding, is essentially it's getting set to AWS current on initialization. It's the rotation or me manually updating it is causing that to no longer be true. And then it throws a exception when trying to do that. When Crossplane then tries to reconcile it through Terraform.
That looks like it is trying to update the stage to AWS current and failing to do so.
Right.
And it should not.
Right. I mean, I do think
that's not what I would expect it to do for a value that's in a init provider.
Right. And I did try it with a init provider and without a init provider. And I do wonder in general, Yeah, because it's weird too, because I almost wonder sometimes like if we should just always set the version stage to and like an init provider value by default, because it
So I can tell you how I use secret version,
sure.
which is that I don't set the AWS current at all. And I give them a management policy that does not include update.
Ah, okay.
And
That's
so it creates the secret version. It gets the data from Kubernetes into Secrets Manager and then forgets about it.
yep, okay. I like that. That makes much more sense for me to do.
So that doesn't at all address the why is the provider throwing this error. This seems like the provider is attempting to update something that it should not update and then failing to do so and getting into an error state. That's a problem. But from your use case, maybe there's just a like
Just hey,
dodge the problem entirely and do something different.
yeah, no, I think that makes sense to me, at least to do that. Because right, I'm really only using it on initialization. I don't ever need to update it. Yeah, no, that makes sense.
Jem, I'm noticing that this version stage is in a list. And I remember you saying something about init provider when you were implementing the init provider merging logic for Upjet. There was something that was difficult to or impossible to reconcile. Would this fall into that category?
It doesn't unless you specify version stages in for provider as well.
In both. Got it.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, and well, I
Is it
almost
getting late initialized?
Yeah, it is initialized properly, and if you don't add it to for provider, nothing should be affected. It should work as it is in the manifest.
So what I'm wondering, does the presence of a value in init provider tell the provider to not late initialize that value in spec.for provider?
Good question, and I don't think it does automatically.
So
Unfortunately, we don't generate
yeah.
rules for that, and so it should be manually done in case we don't want it to be late in it.
So Blake, this is the manifest as applied to the cluster, but what does the manifest look like after it's gone through a reconciliation loop? Is for provider version stages getting late initialized, and then that's why it's trying to do this?
Yeah, it might be possible. Blake, if you have access to your cluster, maybe you can check out if for provider contains any version stages. If it
yeah.
does, that means it is late in it. And unfortunately, in that case, init provider value doesn't take effect. So if it's the case, you can just remove late initialize from management policies and you should be good to go.
Okay, so
Yep.
maybe if I understand late initial, I guess, is this an underlying bug within like Upjet, or is it an underlying bug with Crossplane, or is this just desired behavior somewhere that?
Yeah, indeed, it is the documented behavior. We late initialize by default, and if you would like to handle a special case of late initialization, you have to remove that.
Okay, all right. As long as it's like I'm missing some sort of desired behavior or expected behavior, then I think that makes sense to me. I think for my use case, just removing update from the management policies is probably the best way to go, just because I think it's for my use case. I think that makes sense. But yeah, no, that all makes sense to me. So no, appreciate it.
Yeah, sounds good. So next is Matt. Would you like to talk about your agenda item? This is one that we didn't have time to discuss last time, I guess. Matt, you are muted if you are talking.
Thank you. let's see. I tried to use the Zoom app this morning and it said you have to update it, and then that was taking too long. And so now I'm just on the browser. So what I don't know is if I can actually share my screen from the browser. The gist of, so I ran into this issue with IAM role. My use case is that I would like to use Crossplane's reconciliation loop to, if someone attaches an additional policy to an IAM role, I want Crossplane to remove it. And that is documented behavior. Like the Terraform provider can do that if you put it in a reconciliation loop. So here's the issue, 1357. So the Terraform provider says if you specify the managed policy ARNs or inline policy as an empty array, then the provider will detach any existing policies. If you leave them as null, it will ignore them. And if you put things in them, then it will, I guess if you specify them to any array, it will ensure that that is the exclusive array for either the managed policies or the inline policies. But if you leave them as null, they will, it will ignore them. And when we added these fields, that's what the documentation said. There was a bug where we were late initializing these, which resulted in the role resource getting into a fight with the role policy attachment resource, where it was late initialized just the first, I think what was happening is it would late initialize the first non-empty policy that got attached because it wasn't late initializing empty array. And then there'd be a loop where the one resource reconciles, it attaches the policy. When the other detaches, we fixed it. We backported the fix. The fix was just removing late init from these things. But what I'm finding is that the separate from late initialization, due to what looks like a serialization issue, you just plain can't put an empty collection in one of these fields. And as far as I can tell, the reason for that, so what I'm doing is I apply the resource, and then almost immediately, generation 2 of the resource, the provider removes the managed policy ARN. So it's present here, and then it's absent in generation 2, which is at which point when it's setting the tags. This is just I'm just running this in kind on the with the example manifests. When we define these types, we're always putting in an omit empty tag. And if I remove that tag, that resolves the bug. It's able to distinguish between an empty array and null, because that's sort of exactly what omit empty tells it to not do. So my question, but Upjet doesn't allow, this is not something that I could find a way to configure in Upjet. My big question is, why are we setting omit empty? And should we be, and are there problems if we don't specify omit empty?
Yeah, maybe I might try to rephrase your use case so that we are sure that I understood it correctly. So you want to enforce the fact that this role cannot be attached to any policies, right?
Right. I want to only have the one inline policy and no additional policies.
Okay, so if anyone goes through the AWS console and inserts a policy here, it should be removed by the reconciliation loop.
Yes. Or similarly, I mean, you could do the same thing with the inline policies. Say, I want this role to only have a managed policy. This is the exclusive set of managed policies. Inline policies is empty array. So same thing, and it'll do the same problem too.
Okay, okay. This makes more sense, I guess. So enforcing something is empty makes more sense. If you read my comment on the meeting documentation, I wrote that indeed managed resource arms field is against XRM because we already have a separate resource for managing policy and role attachments, which is role policy, right? But not having any role policies is not going to be able to enforce that not any role is attached to any policies are
Right.
attached to
You
a
can't
role.
you can't use that resource to provide
Yeah. Okay. So
an empty set.
Yeah,
and I think this
seems
was
to answer my question.
I remember that when this the resources, the relevant resources, there's IAM role, there's role policy, which I believe is actually for an inline policy, and then there's role policy attachment, which is for attaching a managed policy. And then there's policy, which is for creating and managing a managed policy. And one of these, I think it was role policy, did not previously exist in the provider. And the only way to manage inline policies was on the role resource. And there was some debate around, do we want to actually do this? Does this violate the XRM? Are we finding more than one place to set this? And I don't remember what the argument was that eventually won the day and resulted in it getting, the PR getting merged. But I think it was around this sort of desire for full expressiveness that without having, and I don't remember what the use case was that couldn't be expressed without it. But this seems like a similar case where it's having these fields on the role is against the XRM in that it provides more than one way to specify the same thing. And not having them is against the XRM in terms of the desire for full expressiveness. The other thing that I noticed when I was trying to look into this, I was like, is this some sort of like Kubernetes controller framework bug? Because I was having a really hard time tracing this down. And I found some reference to saying, in general, Kubernetes controllers should not differentiate between a value that is set to null, a value that is unset, or a value that is set to an empty collection, either empty array or empty object, as a like general principles of a well-behaved Kubernetes controller. But that's not the only way I can think of to solve this in a way that provides both full expressiveness and compatibility with that would be to say to have an additional Boolean field in the spec for provider called like enforce zero managed policies or enforce zero inline policies, as a way of explicitly setting that intent. That seems, it's more explicit, but it's certainly clunkier. It's harder to manage. From my perspective, as like most of my background is in like JVM software development, And the distinction between null and empty object is like, well, yeah, those are obviously different. Why are you getting confused about those things? So I don't really understand why there's a desire on the Kubernetes side to treat those as the same. Similarly, null versus zero values, whether it's an empty string or whatever. But that is there, and I'm sure that the community, there are good reasons for that. I just don't understand what those reasons are.
Yeah, perhaps. I mean, I don't think at least the Kubernetes convention makes sense for us, because having something specified versus not specified is really important, because we are dealing with external APIs here. We are not only doing something in our Kubernetes environment. So
Right.
indeed, it makes sense that we distinguish. And I believe this omit empty is there to enforce that whatever left unspecified is supposed to be omitted in the first place. So it comes
Yeah,
from there.
you know, when we put omit it means that, like, you know, instead of using a zero value, it means that we have no opinion about, you know, that field's value. But when you specify, you know, the zero value instead of not specifying it, then you have an idea, like, you know, about what it should be. It should be an empty list, an empty set, or whatever the zero value is. So initially we included this omit empty, you know, in order to implement this. And as a consequence, like, you know, we have late initialization on top of this. Like, you know, we don't have an idea for spec for provider.x, but if the cloud service provider has a default value for it, then, we, you know, since we don't have an idea about it, we can late initialize it, right? So these two things are, you know, related to each other, and that's why we have this omit empty JSON tag generated.
But we only late initialize non-zero values.
So we late initialize if spec provider for, let's say, .x is not specified. But if it has, like, you know, a value assigned to it, then we don't, right?
If it has a value assigned for it in the manifest, then we do not. If there is a value specified by the provider, and that value is, I'm going to be more specific here. I'm not specific, not necessarily any zero value, but if that value is an empty array, and I suspect also an empty object, then what I observed is that Crossplane does not late initialize that empty object.
Yeah,
Either
so
that or it late initializes it and then removes it when serializing due to the omit empty, doing essentially exactly what I would expect omit empty to do, which would be to omit empty values.
yeah, so I think we are saying the same thing, right? So if it has a value instead of not being specified, then we don't late initialize it, but, you know, we only late initialize if, you know, spec does not have an idea on what it should be.
The problem that I'm seeing here is not about should we late initialize or not. The problem is that
So as
the
I
problem
mentioned,
is that the spec is being when the spec is being serialized and deserialized, that is changing the meaning by removing the field which I deliberately put there.
yeah, so I mean, as I mentioned, late initialization is not the only reason. I mentioned late initialization, but primarily it's like, you know, when you don't use omit empty, and if you don't specify that field, the serialization process puts an M0 value for that thing, right? So the field is not omitted if it has a zero value.
So this
And
is
when the zero value appears there, then suddenly you have an idea on what the value should be. So that's what I'm trying to say.
Okay, so so what you're describing with if omit empty is removed is that basically what you're saying is that we need omit empty because we need to undo something that is automatically transforming null
so
into 0.
yeah, so according to Kubernetes resource model, let's say you have a string field which is optional. Then, Kubernetes resource model, tells you that you should declare it as a pointer to a string with the omit empty JSON tag. So that, since the field is optional, if its value is not specified, you don't suddenly get an empty string, right? So you need to be able to distinguish an empty string from a nil pointer value, right? In order to do this, you need to declare it as a pointer to string. And as I mentioned, Kubernetes resource model tells you to use omit empty in that case.
Okay.
So if you could leave a reference to you mentioned that you have seen somewhere controllers should not distinguish between 0 values and not specified values, if I heard you correctly. It would be great if you could leave a reference so that I can also take a look at the idea expressed.
Sure. I'll try and dig that up again. I don't think I saved it, but I can
yeah, so
I may be able to recreate my search.
As I mentioned, as Jem also mentioned in our use cases, we need to be able to distinguish because when even we specify 0 value, it means that we have an idea on it. So by the way, Matt, I see what you are trying to do here. You are trying to use a feature provided by the Terraform provider so that, the empty list has a special meaning for the Terraform provider, and you are trying to use it here. So I'm not saying that your use case is not valid, but I'm trying to, so you ask why we use this omit empty and why we don't just use 0 values. That's my explanation for this. In this case, in your case, 0 value.
So I'm a relative Go novice, but it seems to me like if we want the behavior of allow a 0 value, say for a string field, and keep that distinguished from a nil pointer, the way to do that is a field of type string pointer to string that can either be nil or contain a value. And if it contains a value, that value might have 0 characters or might have more characters, and we don't particularly care. We just need to track whether it is defined or nil. But it seems like from what the behavior that I saw when I removed the omit empty is that it seems like omit empty is actually transforming 0 into nil. And that seems undesirable.
Yeah, so when you specify an empty list here, it's 0 value. And with omit empty, it's omitted because it says 0 value. It's not, you don't see it in the list. And
or perhaps omit empty is not just omit 0, but omit only. Maybe it only applies to collections.
So yeah, so I was mentioning it we don't have a pointer here, right? So we have a slice type, and the 0 value for it is the empty slice. And you are trying to specifically specify an empty slice which gets omitted.
No, we have a pointer to a slice.
No, it's a pointer of string slice of string pointers. It's not a pointer.
Oh.
We should have had a pointer to a slice of string pointers in order to distinguish between empty slice and nil.
Yeah.
That's there. Okay.
Okay, so it's not the same thing. What you see is a slice of string pointers. So that's
And
you observe
yeah,
this.
and similarly, the inline policy is a slice of objects.
Yes, correct.
So we don't have a way of representing nil.
Yeah. So we discussed this issue, by the way, and you also mentioned that there were some previous discussions on, on these objects. I can't remember those details.
On
Probably.
role policy.
Yeah, so probably I was also involved in them. So as Jem mentioned, this field actually violates the cross-plane resource model. And why cross-plane resource model tells us not to use this field, but instead use, dedicated managed resources to represent the attachment. You mentioned that there is a role policy attachment, managed resource for associating managed policies to IAM roles, right? So XRM mandates us to use that resource, that standalone resource, the managed resource itself, in order to prevent races. So let me ask you a question that will clarify this. Let's say you have 3 role policy attachments and an IRM role, right? And you decide to disassociate them, but you do this by setting managed policy ARNs to an empty slice. And let's assume that we have removed this omit empty here. What would happen is you would end up with a race between 2 different controllers. So the racing controller,
I'd be in a loop.
Controller, and
this is not hypothetical. You're describing a bug that happened in a version of the provider that we released that I then tracked down and fixed.
So, I mean, I'm trying to explain why the cross-plane resource model tells us not to use these embedded fields, but instead we should remove this and have the attachment represented as a managed resource, right?
So
that's the idea.
Sure. That makes sense to me. I understand that. I understand the desire to have one way to specify something because then you don't have like the possibility of fighting. I'm aware of a half dozen other cases in the provider where we have more than one way of specifying something just because of trying to implement all of the Terraform resources without having everyone be able to go through them in great detail. The 2 issues I have with that are, one, the inability to use the individual resource to say there should be no individual, there should be no, to say there should be 0 of them. And the other is, and that's from a that's really from a that's really only valuable from a reconciliation point of view. And from the point of view of undoing external changes. And the idea, it's the difference between you want the crossplane provider to be a manager of this resource in the cloud, and you want the crossplane provider to be the manager of this resource in the cloud. Do you want it to play nice with others, or do you want it to deliberately not play nice with others? And depending on your use case, both of those seem useful in different cases.
So I feel like, the canonical way to do this, you are trying to disassociate all the managed policies that are attached to an IAM role. Or the canonical way would be to import them, or in the first place, to associate them via the crossplane provider. And when you delete them, when you delete the attachment resources, you should be able to disassociate them, right? So this looks more crossplane, way of doing things to me. And one other thing is you mentioned about the high fidelity principle. So it's the high fidelity principle is against the external resource itself, not the Terraform provider. So What I'm trying to say, we don't need to expose each and every feature of the Terraform provider. So, you know, setting this to until this to disassociate all the managed policy ARNs from an IAM role is a specific feature of the Terraform provider. I don't believe the high fidelity principle that you're referencing covers this case. So we don't need to implement each and every feature of the underlying provider. It's an implementation detail. So we try to be, you know, we try to stay high fidelity. We try to keep high fidelity against the external resource itself, like, you know.
That makes sense.
So
But I would argue that we're not keeping like I would argue that the ability to the ability to set an exclusive list is a feature of the AWS API.
yeah, but you know, it's not like through this IAM API. So associating and disassociating manage policies for an IAM role is, of course, you know, an AWS feature, right? But the high fidelity principle tells us, like, you know, to implement those features, if we can do them via separate managed resources, then we still implement them, right? But one thing, Matt, like, you know, I'm not completely refusing this. You should understand it. What I'm saying is, in the first place, I don't remember why we included this field. So there might be, in the past, our approach to the problem was, if certain, like, you know, things are not possible to do with the current API, if we have a feature limitation that we cannot do, you know, in any way, then we can consider this. That's also something that I need to mention. I don't remember the details of the previous discussions,
Okay.
but I do remember there was one use case which was completely impossible to implement.
Was it this discussion?
I don't remember the discussion even. Like, you
Okay.
know, we discussed, you know, similar things with Fatih today. Fatih also doesn't remember the details, and I don't remember why we made this decision. I'm not even sure it was this field, this specific field. Maybe it was inline policies.
I think it was inline policies that we had this discussion about.
I don't remember.
That's
but
this.
like, you
this
know,
there's an issue. I've got. I think I'm sharing it now. Am I sharing the right one? That issue 170, unable to define roles inline policy.
yeah, it could be, like, you know, if you don't have a separate managed resource, like, you know, it may not be available in the Crossplane provider.
Right.
But, you know, if there is such external API, then theoretically we can have that as a managed resource, right? So I don't count that as a limitation. So, but, you know, if there is definitely no possible way to implement a certain scenario, then we could have included this field, but I don't remember. So that's something that Cem and Fatih are going to check.
Okay.
Yep.
But I don't remember, like, you know, why we included that field in the first hand. So
my recollection from going through the Git history is that it was just always there because it was not customized when the resource was added from Terraform. And because these are just fields on the sort of core Terraform resource that, like, of course you have to implement IAM role. You can't do hardly anything if you don't implement that. That they were perhaps not really noticed. So, but I do remember that other discussion. I guess I see a couple of possible ways forward. I would say one is saying that we're not going to support this feature and updating our documentation to say that we don't support this feature, because right now the documentation explicitly says that you can do this and you can't. I see one option as doing that and adding a new field for enforcing emptiness. I see changes to like making emit empty configurable so that for certain resources you could specify a meaningful empty array. It sounds like that would require changes from it would require the type to become a pointer to a slice and not just a slice, which may be challenging. But I would argue would probably be correct. I think, I mean, I'm not like this feature is not going, I'm not going to live or die by this feature. I'm more interested in using it as a way of exploring the like empty versus null question.
Okay, so these all sound good to me, Matt. But I guess at the moment we don't have enough background on the how and why these fields were introduced in the same place. Maybe we can leave the conclusion to the next meeting. That would be better. So I'll come prepared next time. May I ask you to provide the reference in the document, meeting document?
The
And
reference
also,
to the GitHub issue?
yeah, the why init provider was introduced. Excuse me, why init? What was it? What was the field? Inline
policies and managed policy
Yep.
elements.
Yeah, if you could put those references, I'll try to get the background from them. And
Okay.
if you could also list your proposed solutions here, that would also be great.
Do you think that would be better on the GitHub issue or on the meeting doc?
Let me see. Why not on the GitHub issue? Because
I think
I
that would be
believe
better.
that's more discoverable. Yeah.
Yeah. There's a few other people who've commented on this saying like,
Yep.
we're seeing this too.
They would be happy to hear more, I believe.
Okay, great. I'll do that.
All right, then I'll see everyone on the next meeting. Take care.
Are we actually gonna end on time? That's great.
Yes, we did.
We're
We're not
close
on
enough.
time. We are 5 minutes
We're
late.
close.
but this is an improvement.
This is an improvement over 45 minutes so far.
Yep.
Thank you, folks.
Thanks
All
everyone.
right, people. Take care. Goodbye.
Bye. Bye. Bye.